Okay, let us wait for a few seconds. Maybe more people will join us. Okay, I guess we can start now. Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the results of the RBA student survey. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Duygu Yengin. I'm an associate professor of economics and faculty director of gender equity, diversity and inclusion at the University of Adelaide. And it's my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar in my role as the Research, Resources and Data Manager of the Women in Economics Network. And for those of you who are not familiar with our network, Women in Economics Network, which we call shortly WEN, has been formed to promote and support the careers of female economists in Australia. Please follow our webpage, Facebook page, Twitter, LinkedIn, to be informed of various events we regularly organize, as well as newspaper articles, research, job opportunities we share. Today's webinar, we are co-hosting with Economic Society of Australia. WEN is linked to Economic Society of Australia. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of various lands on which all of us join this webinar today. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. There has been a stark decline in the size as well as the diversity of the Year 12 economics student population since the early 1990s. To obtain deeper insight into this fall, Jackie Dwyer, Head of Information Department of the RBA, previously conducted a case study of school level data in New South Wales in 2017. A comprehensive survey of students themselves was needed to gain quantitative evidence of the factors contributing to the decline in economics enrollments, particularly the diversity trends. This webinar today will unpack these findings of this survey conducted by the Reserve Bank in 2019. The survey investigates some important questions, such as why do students choose any subject, profile of economics students, perceptions of economics among the students, topics of interest in economics, and last but not least, how could economics be promoted to attract more students? Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers who will present these findings of this survey and answer those questions for us. We will be joined by Tanya Livermore and Mike Major from the Reserve Bank of Australia. Tanya is the manager of RBA's public education program, which is devoted to supporting economics education through the provision of a range of resources and learning experiences. The education team is also dedicated to developing an empirical evidence base to inform the promotion of economic literacy in Australia. Mike, an economist from the RBA's Economic Research Department, has collaborated with the education team to analyze this data from the survey commissioned by the RBA. At the end of the presentation, we will have some time for questions. So if you have any questions for our speakers about this survey, please post your questions at the Q&A section in the Zoom. There's a button down at the Zoom screen. You can post throughout the presentation. And our National Chair of WEN, Dr. Leonora Rees, will moderate the questions. Now, without further delay, I'd like to invite our speakers to start their presentation.
Thank you very much, Diogo, for the introduction. And thank you to WEN and the ESE for inviting Mike and I to present our research today. So this morning we'll be discussing research that we've undertaken at the RBA to understand what's driving what high school students to choose or to not choose to study economics. As you mentioned, Diogo, the bank recognises the importance of education and is committed to supporting economic literacy in Australia, particularly amongst high school students. And reflecting this commitment, we have a dedicated economics education program that began in late 2016. So being economists, we very much believe in developing rigorous evidence bases upon which to base our objectives in our activities. So to that end, what we'll be presenting today is an overview of, firstly, the background in economics enrolments data that paints a picture of the trends in economics enrolments in high school. And this was integral for us at the bank to bring our attention to Year 12 economics and the trends that have occurred in the enrolment numbers and the diversity of that particular student population. Next, we'll discuss the method and the results from a comprehensive student survey that we've commissioned here at the bank to unpick the factors that are underlying the aggregate picture. And in particular, we examine the reasons in general that students select any given subject, the key factors that in choosing economics in particular, perceptions of economics and how these differ by sex and socioeconomic status. And then we also touch on the topics of interest and how these differ also by sex. And finally, we'll point to some of the implications that these findings have for advocacy of economics. So before we actually get into the detail, we would like to do a quick poll of the audience here today. And we'd like to know from you, did you study economics in year 11 or 12 when you were at high school? So the answers are coming through quite rapidly, which is fantastic. Okay, well, that's fantastic. And I think we will be showing the results of this poll just later on in the presentation. Okay, actually, I think I can share them with you now. So what we see is that around 50% of the audience did study economics in year 11 and 12, which interestingly enough, when we asked the same question amongst economists at the Reserve Bank, we had a similar proportion. And then we have the other half of the audience that didn't study economics for different reasons. So around 10% because didn't know what economics was. A smaller proportion knew about it, but still decided not to do economics. And around a quarter of our audience didn't study economics because it wasn't offered. So it's interesting to see these findings. And, you know, I think for me, I'm in the second category. I didn't study economics because I didn't know what it was. My colleague Mike is in the yes category. And we went to the same high school, interestingly enough, but a few years apart. And I think that it's interesting how even within the same high school, some students may or may not even know what economics is about, depending on the teachers they have at the time. Okay. So getting into our coverage of what our research is today. So what we see here is basically a dramatic decline in economics enrolments for year 12 across Australia. And so starting from the early 1990s until more recently, the enrolments have declined by around 70% over these 3 decades. And to obtain deeper insight into this fall, the bank conducted a case study, as was mentioned, of New South Wales, which we were able to obtain a rich set of school level data. So with the school level data, we were able to break it down according to enrolments trends by sex, by socioeconomic status, and by regional metro location. And what we see is that there's been quite a stark decline in the diversity of the student population alongside the decline in enrolment numbers. So female students are now much more underrepresented compared to male students. There's been a decline in the share of students from low SES backgrounds, and also a decline in the share of economic students that are in regional locations. I think it's really interesting, particularly looking at the female share, in that today female students are outnumbered in an economics classroom 2-to-1 in Year 12. But this hasn't always been the case. In the early 1990s, there was an equal number of male and female students in a Year 12 classroom. So when we realised these trends, the bank initially sought insights from educators to see what they see as the key factors behind this, and a number of insights were offered. Firstly, we were told that students don't understand what economics is or its relevance to them in their study and career paths or their everyday lives. And until the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a lengthy period in which Australian households were not exposed to a major economic contraction or the extensive economic reforms that were part of the national debate in the early 1980s or 1990s. And this works to draw less attention to the relevance of economics to everyday life. But of course, it'd be interesting to see with COVID pandemic and the economics effects indirectly and directly from that, what the change in interest is in economics as a result. It was also suggested that school leadership have limited incentive to promote the subject, partly because too few teachers are trained in teaching economics in particular, and there is little Australian content available to support the teaching of economics at high school. We also hear that the introduction of business studies to the New South Wales HSC in the early 1990s saw a large number of students take up business studies instead of economics. And that the reason that's given for this is that business studies is perceived as being easy to learn and more helpful for employment. And we see this reflected in the aggregate enrolments data as well. There's a very clear correlation between the decline in economics enrolments and the increase in the business studies. So the enrolments data and the insights from educators paint a clear picture of the overall problem, but we still need quantitative evidence on a few things in particular. One is the relationship between student level characteristics, in particular sex, and whether they choose economics when we control for the school characteristics. Secondly, we need quantitative evidence on what perceptions students actually have about economics. So asking the students themselves what they think. So we see their revealed preference away from actually selecting economics, but the decision behaviour is preceded by attitudes and beliefs that shape these preferences. So what are these attitudes and beliefs? And once we know this, we can start to think about effective interventions. And we also want to know how these perceptions differ by sex and socioeconomic status. So again, if we want to promote diversity, we need to understand how the underlying perceptions of these subgroups differ before we design targeted interventions. So before we went into collecting the data, we sought to see what there was already available in the published literature. And our summary is that there's no published research surveying high school students' perceptions of economics or what determines their decision to study or not study economics in senior high school. There is, of course, a body of related literature which helps to form a picture around this question. There is a number of studies that look at the relationship between participation in particular subject areas and students' characteristics using very rigorous longitudinal data. However, the downside is that economics is not separately identified. There is also extensive research that has been done into university students' attitudes to economics, but again, not for the high school student population. And we feel that high school is key as it's early on in the pipeline of someone's experiences with economics and choosing it as a study or career path. If in the years where there's more scope potentially to intervene and shift perceptions, rather than further down the pipeline at university where perceptions and choices may already have been made. So this is where our student survey comes in. So both the survey questions and the answer options were informed by focus groups with year 10, 11 and 12 students, so that we could ensure that the factors contributing to subject selection and the drivers and barriers to selecting economics were adequately represented in the survey and in appropriate language that will resonate with the younger age group. The actual survey method, we had a sampling frame which was all high schools in New South Wales, students in years 10, 11 and 12, and our selection of schools was stratified to attain representative coverage by sector and metro versus regional location. The survey was actually administered by Ipsos, a large survey company. It was delivered using their online survey platform, which students completed in class under the supervision of their teachers. And the survey was open during term 3 of 2019, which I'm very grateful that this was undertaken last year and we weren't planning this for this year, because I think it would have been a very different story. Okay, so going to the sample that we obtained, we had 51 schools participate in the survey, representative splits by sector and location. And we do have a small number of single sex and selective high schools as well. The total sample of students that we obtained from these 51 schools was over 4,800. The split of students is weighted a little more towards year 10, primarily because schools were more inclined to have their year 10 students participate than the students who are undertaking their HSE years. But we do have quite a large number of year 11 and 12 students. Amongst the year 11 and 12 students, 189 of those are studying economics, which is 9% of this sample, and corresponds directly with the overall proportion of New South Wales students that do study economics in year 11 and 12. So I'm going to pass now to my colleague Mike, who will talk through the results.
Thank you, Tanya. So now I'll take you through some of the results from the survey. And I'll start with the reasons that students cite when deciding what subjects they choose in general, before narrowing in into economics itself to see if these reasons are different when choosing economics. Now, as Tanya mentioned before, I'll then be able to use the survey data to tease apart the student level and school level characteristics that correlate with economics enrolments, while controlling for other factors. We'll then move into some of the more novel work where we look at the perceptions about economics from different students, and importantly, how they differ across sex and SES. This will give us insights into what might be driving the differences in participation and the diversity trends that Tanya discussed before. And finally, we will look at what topics students find interesting about economics and how these also differ by sex. And this can help us find out areas where you may have to focus on when promoting economics. So firstly, to move on to the reasons for economics. So what we did here is we asked students to select from a list of possible reasons they might use when thinking about subjects. And what we have in this chart here is it shows the most cited reasons at the top and the least cited reasons down the bottom. And this is for all students at the moment when choosing all subjects. So what we find is these top 4 reasons here is that the key reasons why students choose subjects is because they find the subject interesting, they think they're good at it, and there's also they're aware of the future work and future study opportunities that come from it. So these reasons are cited more than things like recommendations from parents, teachers, peers and siblings, and things to do with the subject itself, like the workload and the timetabling. Now, one interesting thing about this though is about 2/3 of students still cited that they got a recommendation from their parent, teacher, peer or sibling. But what we see when we think about these results together is it seems like the recommendations are important, but they're important. The way they work is by, building interest or by informing the students about their future work and future study. And I think that's a good and important takeaway to think about. Ultimately, the students need those top 4 things, and recommendations need to be based that help them with those 4 things. So a question we had now is, we'll move on to, well, are these reasons different for economic students themselves? Again, they're still thinking about students and subjects in general, but thinking about just the subset of people who do economics. And we find those top 4 reasons are very similar. It's still interest, it's still the future work and future study opportunities, and still whether they're good at it. So we'd say that they're pretty similar reasons. One thing that comes out of it, though, is that the ATAR scaling. So this is students who do economics tend to be more sensitive to whether subjects scale well for the ATAR. So that's something to keep in mind, that we have a bit of a difference there. However, on the whole, we'd say they're quite similar. So now what I'll do, though, is narrow into economics as a subject. And so here we look at what reasons students cited for when they chose economics. So we're just looking at the group of people here who do economics. Now, again, we see that interest is the #1 reason. But I think what an interesting result from this is, though, is the second most cited reason is actually that economics equips them with skills they can use for everyday life. And this was a lesser consideration for other subjects that we see in the middle panel there. I think the other thing to take away from this as well is that if you look at the bottom one there, the least cited reason was that they were recommended to do economics. So this suggests that this is one channel where, it hasn't been as common as we see in some of the other results there. So what does this mean? Well, it means there's a great deal of scope to fill the information gaps about how economics might help with future work and future study, and about building interest in economics. It also says that positioning economics as a subject that provides skills for everyday life could yield some interest, as we see those who chose economics rated this reason quite highly. So what we'll do now is we'll go into not what the reasons they chose for subjects, but the determinants of studying economics. So what student level and school level factors are relevant in who goes on to choose economics. And so Tanya went through some of these before in the NESA data, but what we're able to do is isolate these key effects. And the key thing we find is that there is a greater likelihood of males and students from high SES schools studying economics. And in particular, we find this even when we control for a bunch of things. Even when we control for how interested they are in a subject, even when we control for other demographics, for their understanding, for how focused they are on the ATAR and other school-specific factors. And so I think, well, I'll step through this in a bit more detail in a second, but one overarching thing is that we see that SES is the key factor here. And so while we do see on their own that things like whether they're from a metro school or from a non-government school or high SES, the key driver behind these is the high SES part. We actually see the results reverse for the other ones when we control for the socioeconomic status of schools. And I'll come through this now in a bit more detail. So the way we test this is we use a probit model, which is a regression technique that looks at the likelihood of studying economics based on all these other factors. And then we can isolate what the effect of a particular factor is while holding everything else constant. So what I've got here is a positive number here implies that they're more likely to study it. So the first result there, it says that if you're male, you're more likely to study economics, controlling for all these other factors. Likewise, ICSIA, which is a measure of the socioeconomic status of the students at a school, is also positively related. So we see that high SES schools are more likely to study economics. So those two results below, though, we actually see that region is not significant. So those asterisks there imply whether or not it's statistically significant. And we find actually that students in non-government schools are actually less likely to study economics. But as I was saying before, the key reason for this is because we're controlling for the socioeconomic status of the students. So if we go to the second regression now, I take out the socioeconomic status variable, and we see the males are still positively significant. But actually, if you look down here at the region and the non-government, what we find is that now we find that students in a regional school are less likely, which is what's consistent with the results that Tanya showed earlier. And we see that there's actually no real difference in non-government, or potentially positive, but not statistically significant. So our takeaway from this is that it's the male and the SES dimensions that are most relevant here for the likelihood of studying economics. Now, to explore this in a bit more detail, we can use some other information from the survey. So we can control for other factors that might explain these trends. So we do this in a simple way by adding in a control variable for these three extra variables. So we control for the level of interest that students have in economics, and we still find that positive result for male and SES. Likewise, for whether they have a good understanding of economics, and also for how sensitive they are to how subject scales the ATAR. Now, an interesting thing about this, though, is while we still see those positive results, it does look like the effects are a little bit lower on the male variable there when we control for these things, particularly interest and understanding. And so what this suggests is that part of the reason why we might see some of these gender divides could be because there's a difference in the interest or the understanding of what economics is. However, I think it's important to know, though, that they're still positive and significant. So it's not the whole story, but it could be part of the reason. And this kind of leads us on to why it's important to look at the perceptions of economics to try and really understand this relationship a bit more. So what we did for perceptions is we asked all the students in the survey across all years here, so year 10, year 11 and 12, about their perceptions of economics. And we got a range of statements, often based on things we got from the focus groups that Tanya mentioned before, from liaison, from the media. And we basically asked students to rate them on a scale of strongly disagree up to strongly agree on a 5-point scale for a range of statements. And what we find is economics as a discipline in general is perceived quite positively. But when you look at economics as a subject in year 11 and 12, they're often students cite that they have a lack of interest or lack of relevance or understanding. And so this year is a challenge here, is to try and build the interest and bring that economic subject up to the level of the discipline itself. So to step through this in a bit more detail, here's a list of all the different perceptions that we ask students about. And I've ranked them here from things that the students agree most with to things they least agree with. And so the way I've constructed these for the purpose of the graph is I've looked at the share of respondents who strongly agree minus the share of respondents who strongly disagree. And I've ranked them as so. And we get similar trends if we use the average or use other forms of net balance. Now we ask questions both on economics in general as a discipline and then economics as a subject. And so to start with, let's look at the economics in general. So what we find is that students tend to agree that economics is used for social good, a very promising result. It's also a wide range of careers comes out of economics. We see these other two highlighted results, which is that students don't think it's all about money, and comfortingly also, they do not think that it's more a career for men. And these are two things that do go against some of the anecdotal evidence we've heard. So it at least suggests that the students, when they write these on the survey, that they are not thinking that these are key perceptions. So now if we narrow into economics as a subject, we see some positive things. So students cite that it's important in society, that they could do well in economics, and that it scales well for the ATAR. We also see this result that it provides them skills for everyday life, which is something that we saw before about the factors when I was discussing the reasons for choosing subjects. However, when we look at some of the other results, they're a bit more negative. So we see that students tend to see that business is more useful, more interesting and easier. We also see that as a heavier workload and that you need mathematics for it. But these particular ones I want to point out are these bottom four here, where they don't tend to have a good understanding. They're not very interested in them, and they don't have a clear idea of the careers available. So while we saw that as economics as a general discipline has a wide range of careers, it seems like there's a bit of a divide between how economics as a subject is going to help them get there, or what careers in particular they would do with them. So it's more of a general, there's a lot of careers out there, but they don't know how they're going to fit into that as well. The other thing is that they're pretty neutral on whether or not they want to know more about economics as well. So what I want to do now is think about how these perceptions differ by females or by low SES. And what we find is that the negative perceptions we have here tend to be exacerbated for females and students from low SES schools. And so if we go to the next slide here, we see that we have, again, the same perceptions that we had before, but we have a split by whether they were male or female. And so underpinning this graph are order-appropriate regressions like I was showing before. But rather than showing the tables, what I've done here is I'm just going to put 2 asterisks when there is a statistically significant difference between males and females on any of these perceptions. So to talk you through some of these, firstly, what we see is that there is a bit of a confidence gap between men and women here. So females are much less likely to think they could do well in economics compared to males. They're also more likely to think that business is more useful, more interesting, and easier compared to males. And so we see some of these effects have been exacerbated by being female. Furthermore, if you go to some of these bottom ones, we see that that females tend to have less interest, less understanding. They have even less of an idea of what careers could be available to them. They also find that they perceive that they aren't as promoted by teachers, and they see it there's a bit more risk aversion here. They see that it's a risk to study economics because they don't know what it's about. I think another result here is they also are less likely to want to know more about it. So it kind of raises a particular challenge for us when thinking about how to promote economics, when you have to both generate interest but also have to somehow generate the interest in wanting to know more about it. Now, it's also worth pointing out that there's no meaningful differences in some perceptions. So we don't see any differences in needing to be intelligent or being good at maths. There's no differences in the workload or scaling. And we also don't see any significant differences in the idea that economics is important, that it's used for social good, or that equips you for day-to-day life. So there are some things that are similar across these groups. But this confidence gap and risk aversion does seem to be more of a trend for the females than the males here. Now, we also see these results when looking at socioeconomic status. And so again, I've broken down the survey to look at those students from a low SES school and those from a high SES school. And again, we see this evidence of a confidence gap where students from low SES schools are less likely to think they could do well in economics. We also see that they think it's a risk because they don't know about it. They also think they're less likely to be promoted by their teachers, and they have a less understanding of economics too. And this last point has come up a few times, this idea of not having as much of an understanding of what economics is about. And so we thought we'd explore this in a bit more detail. So we'd run these regressions that underpin these results on the graph I show you here, where we control for the perceived understanding. And so what we find is that controlling for the level, so in other words, taking out the fact that there might be differences in understanding across these groups, we find that this does reduce some of the SES and sex differences that we have just talked about. However, it's not the full story. So it suggests that improving understanding will help some of these differentials, but there are some things that still remain. There's more that needs to be done than just this. And in particular, we still see an evidence of a confidence gap. We still see evidence of a greater degree of risk aversion towards economics because they don't know what it's about. And we still see that they're more likely to perceive business studies to be easier, more interesting and useful than economics. And so this implies that interventions that not only provide information, but somehow boost the confidence of females and students from low socioeconomic status backgrounds may go further in equalizing both perceptions and participation in diversity as well. So it sort of implies that we have to both think about the confidence side as well as the information side. Now, one result we did find as well throughout is that men tend to be more interested in economics, even controlling for the level of understanding. So even if they have the same level of understanding, men seem more interested. And this kind of made us think, well, maybe it's to do with what kind of topics are discussed in economics. And so what we did is we also asked students to rate what topics they find most interesting from a list of things that they do in the Year 12 and Year 11 economic syllabus. And so students had to choose their top 2 out of a list of about 7 or 8, and that was to determine what the most interesting topics would be. So what we find in this next chart is that the 2 most important reasons that, or the 2 most important topics that students find interesting are identifying problems and globalization. And you can see some of the other ones down here, things like the share market, consumption, production decisions, the environment. These ones are still important, but they're not as high up. But I think the more interesting thing here is now to have a look at these differences across sex. So what we see is there are some key differences. Firstly, that result about identifying problems that we saw before is actually being driven mostly by female, and that's their top interest in this. Whereas for men, they cite the share market as their number one, and you can see that's very low down for women. So this sort of points out that we've got to be mindful of not just economics as a general discipline, but also what parts of economics we want to be like highlighting or promoting or giving information about when thinking about it, to make sure that we're not getting a narrow view of what economics is about. So what I'll do now is I'll pass back to Tanya to think a bit more about the implications.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, so in terms of what are the key implications for advocacy of economics and the diversity within economics, starting firstly with to address the overall participation. What Mike mentioned earlier was that one thing that stands out to us is that we see a challenge to translate the positive perceptions of economics in general to be applied to high school economics as a subject. There's also scope to fill information gaps on the key reasons that students have now told us that they take into account when they're choosing any given subject. So that's their interest in the subject, the future career options, and the future study options that come about. So we also see that positioning economics as a subject that provides skills for everyday life may also yield interest. This was something that economics students rated quite highly, and was an interesting result for us to learn about one factor that could definitely be highlighted and emphasised in communicating to students about the benefits of economics. So this summary here gives us confidence in terms of our program at the bank that we are focusing on these things already, and it also gives us confidence that there's more that we can do to build on this going forward and hopefully generate more interest and participation in economics overall. So what about addressing the diversity deficits in economics? So we've established that there is a differential in the perceptions of economics between the sexes and students of different socioeconomic backgrounds, which reveals the underlying attitudinal factors that are reflected in the divergent likelihood of studying economics. So importantly, females and students from low SES backgrounds are less likely to perceive that they have a good understanding of what economics is. And so interventions that improve students' understanding of what economics entails should work to not only increase participation in economics overall, but to actually reduce some of those diversity gaps in the participation numbers. And as Mike mentioned earlier, it's not just about increasing understanding in terms of addressing the diversity gaps. There's also evidence that we have here now that boosting confidence is part of equalising those differentials. So we see that an implication is that when thinking about interventions, we need to also not just think about providing information in general, but what might boost confidence of females and students from low SES backgrounds. And another key implication in terms of diversity is that there appears to be scope to tailor communications and syllabus content that appeals to the specific interests of female students. So what are the next steps for developing the evidence base for us here at the bank and anyone else who's has an interest in advocacy of economics? So firstly, primarily, we see that empirical testing of potential interventions is key. What we know is that while we can take information from perceptions that will give us a much clearer direction in terms of interventions, we also need to test these in some way because we never know, there can be unintended consequences of particular interventions. We want to make sure that anything we do put into place, particularly around diversity, actually goes to improving the situation. So empirical testing of interventions is key. We also see that there's further work to be done on looking at how economics content in Australia aligns with the interests of female students. So this is also an area for future work. Another obvious area for future work is looking at the perceptions of high school students about economics in other Australian states and territories. What we know is that economics is introduced to students at different stages of their high school progression across the various states. And so there might be important differences in how students actually perceive economics depending on how early they are introduced to economics content. So there's scope for future work to actually examine these questions in other states in Australia. In terms of the New South Wales survey data that we have, there's further work that we plan to do on looking at the role that commerce plays in New South Wales students' perceptions of economics, because that's obviously another way at which within New South Wales students can be introduced to economics at earlier stages than year 10, 11 or 12. So this is what we wanted to present for our research today, but we are very happy to take questions, and I can see that there's a number that have been popping up as we've been presenting. So I'll now pass over to Jugu to facilitate Q&A.
I'm going to bring it to a close in terms of questions and hand back to Jugu, and thank you for all the questions. I hope I've summarised it, and you can see there's a great conversation to be had here, so thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Tanya, for this wonderful presentation, and Leonora for the moderation of questions, and special thanks to Diane for helping with the admin support. So as we have seen, economics has a problem because students don't understand it or don't have an interest in it. And this is one of the areas that Women Economics Network is working to make a difference. So I would like to invite everyone today to continue supporting us by joining WAN membership or renewing your memberships, so that we can continue to bring you webinars like today and other initiatives. So thank you again for joining us today, and have a great day and stay safe.